The Forked Ways. Chapter 13. Oppositioner. Cotton's features twisted in agony at the blade which pinned him to the wooden countertop, but his eyes held no trace of outrage. Instead, there was recognition, submission, and something like awe. He fumbled with the sickle, trying to pull it free, but the cloth binding the stumps of his severed fingers made it impossible. Fletch grasped the sickle and jerked it upwards, freeing Cotton from the countertop. The man opened his hand, palm upward. Blood flowed down his wrist to his elbow and dripped onto the counter. "You want something to eat?" he asked Fletch. "What'll you have?" Fletch couldn't fathom what the man meant by the words. "The tobacco," he told him, "and the jerky, that's all." Cotton winced, lowered his bleeding hand, and nudged the items in Fletch's direction. "I thought you were like her, like the old woman, but you're not. I've been calling you to serve you. We've always served you." Fletch's ears began to ring. He felt trapped, short of breath, and knew he had to escape from the shop into the open air. A truck was pulling up beside the porch of the bait shop, and he didn't want to be caught here. He delivered his message, bought tobacco. Now he needed to get away, back to the forest. "I'm not what he says I am." He stuffed his purchases into his knapsack, shouldered his way through the screen door, and heard it slam behind him as he descended the rough plank steps. The sickle. He had left the sickle on the counter. But there was no going back for it. Across the road, beyond a barbed wire fence, the forest rose up like a great green wave. It would cover him, conceal him, give him space to breathe. At the edge of the highway he hesitated, torn between the impulse to flee and something else, an awareness that his work was still unfinished. He had to return to the road with the terrible houses. He feared the place, but in this experience of strange, fierce clarity, he was sure something else was required of him, something he had to accomplish, though he had no idea what it might be. Carla Wills was nowhere in sight when he passed her house, though the wash hung on the line. The dog no longer barked, but whimpered and cowered in the dust. Fletch continued around the curve of the dirt road and stopped. The heat bore down from a blazing sun. Insects buzzed in the dry grass. He crossed the roadside ditch and stood at the edge of one of the yards. The houses were dead, but they were still dangerous. In the same way the severed head of a snake will continue to extend its fangs and strike, each of these houses had long ago been killed, but violence and dread still held the boards together. On the narrow porch of one of the houses was a metal folding chair, and part of the feeling came from there. In a shattered glass jar among the briars, he found several rifle cartridges which had never been fired. Behind the last house, he came upon a shallow gully hidden by weeds. Whatever sense had drawn him here now made it plain that this empty ditch was the place to which he had been called. He could taste his own fear in the dry, desperate air. What if something was inside the house, watching him through one of the shattered windows? What Fletch did next took more effort than anything he had ever done in his life. He lay down in the gully and stared up through the dry brown grass at the distant sky. This place was so lonely. Someone had died here, he was sure, in this very spot, died in horror and pain. The house creaked slightly, as if it were leaning toward him. Then there was the sound of something moving through the weeds, and a smell of dank water and decay. The grass parted above the ditch. He actually saw it move, but whatever came through was invisible. Time passed, torturing seconds of knowing something was standing over him, but not knowing what it would do. Eventually he realized it was waiting too. His lips opened. The sound was nothing but a dry croak. "Jarrett?" The name had emerged without his even thinking it, but at least he had a voice. "I don't hate you," he said with an effort, "but I don't understand you, and you frighten me." There was no movement in the grass, no change in the air above him. He could tell that whatever had been there had gone, and nothing had been resolved. He sat up in the ditch, his terror replaced by desolation. The dead needed help, but they were dangerous. Still, he couldn't leave without trying something else. He opened the pouch of tobacco and took out a small handful of the shredded leaves. It wasn't remade tobacco, but maybe it would do. He stood up and scattered it in the ditch. The hike to the labyrinth took a long time. Fletch was hot. He hadn't eaten anything, and he felt unbearably thirsty. Should have asked Cotton for a Coke, he thought. What did he mean, oppositioner? That's from Led Zeppelin. Stairway to Heaven played in reverse. The oppositioner, isn't that the devil? Now and then he stumbled. The air was heavy and the cry of the insects was merciless. At the entrance to the labyrinth he put on his makeshift blindfold, and though he followed the trail easily enough, he began to feel nauseous and dizzy. The sickle had been part of the wolf's world, he reasoned, and it had infected him. The physical memory of how the tool had felt in his hand sent twanging metallic waves of illness through his skin. He could taste the wood and iron as if he had absorbed it. The buzzing insects took up residence in his brain. His blind journey through the maze was torturous. There was no sense of forward movement, only the same futile steps endlessly repeated. The darkness suffocated him, and the only light he could imagine was the pale green curve of the sickle's blade. At last, completely disoriented, he removed the blindfold and found he hadn't reached the clearing. He was at the edge of a field. A small house stood nearby. Betsy Weathers was in the field, pitching hay onto a haystack. She stopped and lifted her hand. Fletch waved back, trying to find strength to be polite, even if she was only part of his delirium, but he began to feel even worse. I need shadows, green and cool. I need low oak branches, moss, and drifts of leaves. Betsy put down her pitchfork and came over. She rested one hand on his shoulder, the other on his head, but it was too late. Black water closed over him and he began to drown. Somewhere in the darkness a fleeting scent of grass and cool earth. A small room, the bed a narrow wood-framed cot stretched with canvas. On the table a few religious pictures, the crucifixion, the descent into hell, the supper at Emmaus. On the windowsill a bottle of blue glass. Fletch opened his eyes and found the room was real. The t-shirt he had used for a blindfold was draped over a ladder-backed chair, and his sneakers were on the floor beside it. The cabin was smaller than any house he had ever seen, but comforting, almost familiar. It contained only the cot and 2 chairs, a little table, a cupboard, and a broom. The wallpaper bore colonial designs, a fireplace, snowshoes, a bearskin rug. More glass bottles rested on the shelves which lined the walls. His panic and illness had gone, leaving him still and calm. He didn't care whether this was a dream or a vision, as long as he could cling to its precarious sense of peace. The light entering the open window had the look of early evening, and he went to the door of the cabin to look out. Betsy was laying out rows in a half-acre patch of garden with an old push-plow. The wind came from the field, and the freshly turned earth smelled safe and strong. Betsy looked up from her work, acknowledged him, and finished the row. "Feeling better?" she asked. "You want a Coca-Cola?" Fletch shook his head. "I'm okay now, thank you." He nodded at the garden. "Want some help?" "It's hard work for a body this old. Be dark soon, though, and you just got back on your feet. I can finish up tomorrow unless you just want to try your hand at it." He put the plow to the earth and began to push a new row into light. The cooling soil sank beneath his bare feet and pulled against the plowshare, falling into soft, fragrant lines. Quiet settled around him. He had come to the forest to find the wolf, but things here had taken their own course. As he pushed the plow, he glimpsed a truth he should have suspected all along. Something was coming, something dangerous. If he survived it, he would always feel love and have pity. He might be able to help other people, and even ease the burdens of the dead, but he would never be able to help himself or heal his own wounds. Even if he devoured the wolf, he would never be rid of it. Night began to wake up in the surrounding trees, and by the time he had finished only a few rows, it had grown too dark to work. "I'll take that coat now," he said to Betsy. They sat on the stone steps of the cabin and listened to the night. "I could stay here," he thought wistfully. "I could stay and plow the furrows and be young and wise and drink Coca-Cola." The world would be gentler than the one he had left, because everything here would hold the power to heal. The small streams, the fields and forest, the long roads under stars. If he met the wolf here, he could face it, because he would have all the strength of the land behind him. "You look troubled, Fletch," said Betsy. "What's the matter?" "I'm sure you know," Fletch said wearily. "Isn't that why you're here?" Her hands held a slight tremor, and he almost apologized because she seemed so much like the real Betsy. When she spoke, her voice was compassionate. "It's a wearisome, twisting way," she said. "The forked ways cross roads as often as they follow them. Not many folks are made to travel them, at least not with their eyes open." "I've been walking blindfolded," Fletch told her. It was a weak attempt at humor and an apology for his rudeness. "Not any longer. When folks like us first began, we walk open-eyed and don't see a thing. Then we blindfold ourselves to keep from getting distracted. And finally we take the blindfold off and try to bear the gift of sight. Maybe that's happening to you." "Whatever's happening isn't enough," he said bitterly. "I need strength. Can you give it to me?" She stood up. "I reckon I can try." She went into the cabin and returned with her hammered dulcimer. With the instrument balanced on her knees, she began to play a plaintive folk song. When she began singing the words, Fletch recognized them. It was a song his mother had sung when he was small, as she moved about the house, occupied with her own thoughts. "Down in yon forest there stands a hall. The bells of paradise I hear them ring. It's covered all over with purple and pall, and I love my Lord Jesus above anything." "When I was a girl," Betsy said, "we sang that song at the Sabbath Oak, the tree at the church campground." She nodded. "Yes, it's there as well. But here," she swept her hand around them, "here it's deep in the forest, deeper than the outlanders ever go." "I don't think I believe in Jesus anymore," Fletch told her grimly. "You've been through a great deal, and you're young. Give it time. There's not a thing in this world he's not inside of. Heaven and earth meet in him, and every bird that flies, every frog that jumps in the water, he's there. And he's inside you, whether you know it or not." She tapped his chest with her finger. "When you're able to find him there, you'll start to recognize him everywhere. Raise up a stone, and there you'll find him. Cut the wood, and there he'll be." "What did you mean a few minutes ago? Folks like us," you said. "Cotton says that I'm not like you. He thinks I'm the oppositioner." Betsy sighed. "Cotton. Of course he would think that. He means the adversary. But you're the opposite of what he's talking about. You're the advocate, the paraclete. Or you will be if I've seen things rightly." The moon was rising, turning the grass silver, and they watched its ascent in silence. "Come around back," she said at last, patting his knee. She put the dulcimer on the step and led him around the cabin to a patch of tall, broad-leaved stalks, bearing clusters of dark berries. Betsy pinched off one of the berries and broke it between her fingers. The juice was deep red. "Pokeweed," she informed him. "Hold out your hands." He did so, unquestioning. Gently she took each of his hands in turn and broke one of the berries against the center of each palm. "Don't worry about your disbelief," she said quietly. "Just be what you are." "I don't know what I am." Betsy stepped back, and her quick, bird-like eyes fixed on his, merry and powerful and severe. "One thing you will never be is a slave, to the devil, to Christ, or to anyone else. You are free," she said. Shape of a rat. Josh Avery took a shovel from the rack in the tool shed and went to retrieve the jug from beneath the workbench. It was time to dispose of Cotton's prank and try to air out the place. The whole room stank with a reek that was almost suffocating. It took only a moment to realize why. The burlap, which had been bound across the mouth of the jug, lay on the floor beside it, sodden and shredded, in a puddle of noxious fluid. The jug itself contained nothing but liquid and a few scraps of what might have been fur and skin. Josh's first thought was that some animal, maybe a raccoon, had been attracted by the stench and had pillaged the jug of its contents, but the jug was still upright. Surely that thing couldn't have escaped. At the scrabbling sound behind him, Josh whirled and raised the shovel. The animal from the jar lay in a corner, its limbs moving feebly. It had the shape of a rat, but bigger, its wet fur a mass of spikes and snarls. Cautiously, Josh came closer, and the animal opened its eyes. They were without any gleam of perception, as blank and lifeless as beads. At a prod from the blade of the shovel, the creature opened its mouth. The beam of the shop light gleamed on rows of metal shards, which seemed to serve as teeth. It emitted a gurgling rasp, twisted onto its back, and froze into stillness. More prods from the shovel brought no response. Josh wedged the shovel beneath it and lifted it, carried it out into the yard. It slipped to the ground and split apart, the rotting flesh breaking free along a row of stitches. What was this thing? Blood, organs, sticks, and wire. Teeth made from broken razor blades. Eyes of beads carved of bone. The sodden stuffing looked as if it were mostly composed of shredded comic books bound with electrical tape. It had been a gaff, but a living one. He secured the animal's body in a plastic garbage bag, then, as a precaution, fetched another to slip over the first. He carried the bag just within the edge of the trees and began to dig. When the hole had reached a depth of about 2 feet, he lowered the bag into it and filled it in. From beneath the tool shed, he took 2 concrete blocks and placed them on the tightly packed earth. The task finished, he paused to wipe his brow. A bird chirred among the shadows of the hedge. Down the street, a dog barked. Again, Josh returned to the tool shed, retrieved a piece of blue chalk from the workbench, and used it to mark a cross on one of the concrete blocks. After a moment's hesitation, he scratched a different mark on the other block, a symbol carnival folk sometimes used to ward off the evil eye. Another shape. Dwight Wills sat on the school bus, his body still aching from the blows he had received the night before. Looking out the window as the countryside slid by, he wondered if things would ever change, if his father would ever become less of a monster. It didn't seem likely. Things had been getting worse lately, much worse. This wasn't normally Dwight's route. It was the route the Forrester boy took, and that pack of Avery children, the one that stopped near the co-op. As the bus approached Rowan Street, he noticed that the barber shop was still sealed off with crime scene tape. Everyone had heard what had happened, how during renovation an inner wall had been demolished and a child's skeleton had been discovered. It was old, probably 100 years old, someone had said. That was creepy. It being back there all these years, only a few feet away while he had been getting haircuts at the shop, looking at him through the wall. Dwight glanced across the aisle at Susanna Nelms, who was dragging her book bag from under her seat. The Avery kids were already at the front of the bus, jostling each other for first position in line. Dwight slid into the aisle and moved up behind them. The bus stopped at the curb and the door opened. Dwight bent down to worry at the knotted lace of one of his sneakers, and by the time he stood up, the Avery children had scattered. He stepped down off the bus and turned to look at Susanna. "That book bag looks heavy. You want me to carry it for you?" "Thanks." The girl looked up at him curiously. "You don't usually ride our bus." Dwight shrugged. "I had some things to do in town. I'm supposed to meet up with Fletch Forrester." Susanna brightened. "Are you friends with Fletch?" "Oh, yeah. He and I hang out together all the time." "Is he back from running away? Why wasn't he at school?" "He's been working on something. Fact is, he's working on it right now. It's something for you." "What's he doing?" "He made me promise not to tell, but I guess I could show you." Dwight hesitated. "You know that barn over by the lake? He said to stop by there on the way home. He's over there right now waiting for us. We'll have to make it quick, though." The little girl looked uncertain. "Which barn is it?" "The one down by the water. It's back of that big house where Fletch lives." He thought of the dimness there, the light coming through the holes in the rotten roof. They would have to take the path that led along the gully, then backtrack through the woods. People would be less likely to see them that way. "If you're not interested, that's okay. I'll just tell Fletch that you were in a big hurry to get home." "I'm not in a hurry," she insisted. "I want to see him. I found out something about the troll he needs to know." "Okay, come on then. I don't want to wait around." Dwight was suddenly nervous. There was a feeling a little like nausea deep in his stomach. He knew he'd better act quickly before he chickened out. At the entrance to the path, he glanced up and down the street, then helped Susanna down the steep slope. In a few minutes, the town and buildings were behind them. The common garden, barely visible through the dense screen of trees, was soon hidden by the slope of the hill. They climbed a steep, rocky ledge and followed the trail down to the lake. Soon he could see the deserted orchard behind the pastorium, and beyond that, the roof of the crumbling barn. "This is kind of spooky," Susanna said uneasily. "I've never been back here before." "Not much farther. We're almost there." Dwight found the way through a thicket of briars to the door of the barn. He was suddenly vividly aware of the scarred wood, the curving marks a spinning saw had left on the broad, heavy planks. The latch was little more than a hunk of rusted iron, but the door was only wedged shut. It shuddered open at the first tug. Stale, unpleasant air flowed out of the gaping doorway. He could barely discern the shapes within. Disused farming equipment from a bygone era, old cotton bales rotting in a corner. Slowly his eyes grew used to the dark. Far away in a back corner, a figure rose up. Dwight could see the gleam in his father's eyes. Cotton Wills came forward, shirtless, dressed in a pair of overalls. In one ruined hand, a cluster of aluminum cans dangled from a plastic strap. In the other, he grasped a sickle. "You did good, boy," he said in a slurred voice. "Have a beer." Behind his father, Dwight sensed another shape, dark and ravenous. For a moment it almost seemed as if that presence were the real thing, and his father only the shadow. "Bring her on in and shut the door. When I'm done, you can have the bones." Dwight found himself unable to move. His father's hand flashed out, trailing a bloody bandage, and Susanna jumped back with a scream. Dwight grabbed her, pulled her back into the sunlight, and kicked the barn door shut with his foot. "Run!" he shouted. "Run home fast!" The girl broke from him and fled. With a thud, the door burst open, knocking Dwight to the ground. Cursing, Cotton Wills grabbed him by the hair and jerked him upright, spittle flying from his savage, snarling mouth. The man slapped him, and Dwight stumbled, his mind fogged with fear and pain. He could see that Susanna was already down by the lake, but he knew his father could still catch her. Dwight groped in the weeds, pulled up a heavy piece of rusted metal, a harrow or tine from a plow, and swung it with all his strength. His father's lower jaw broke with a snap. Teeth flew from his mouth, rattling against the side of the barn like hail. Dwight managed another blow, shattering the man's arm. Overcome by dizziness, sobbing and gasping for breath, he stared down at his father, scarcely recognizing him. Then he turned toward the lake, looking for Susanna. Someone else stood at the water's edge. For a moment, Dwight thought it might be Betsy Weathers. Then he saw that it was a young girl he didn't know. The girl opened her arms, and Susanna ran to her. In a moment, the two of them were gone. Then he saw a third figure. It crawled from the edge of the lake and rose up, weaving slightly. It was small, black, covered with mud or tar. He could discern no facial features, but a hole gaped open, filled with teeth. The figure moved forward, staggered and fell, and began pulling itself toward him. Cotton Wills groaned. His hand reached out and caught the leg of Dwight's jeans. Dwight glanced down at him fearfully. Then he jerked free and ran.